Hi, hello. This is Polly Young-Eisendrath and Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I'm here with Charles Eisenstein. I'm very happy to be here with Charles. And Charles is a speaker and an author whose writing and teaching cover a wide range of topics, including the history of human civilization, economics, spirituality, and the ecology movement. According to Eisenstein, global culture is immersed in a destructive story of separation, and one of his main objectives is to present an alternative story of interbeing. Much of his work draws on ideas from Eastern philosophy and spiritual teachings of indigenous peoples. Among Eisenstein's notable works are The Ascent of Humanity, Sacred Economics, and then his recent and I think widely received essays, Coronation and the Myth of Conspiracy, and then the later one, The Banquet of Whiteness. On my own podcast, Enemies from War to Wisdom, and in my work in Real Dialogue, my latest book, Love Between Equals, and my writing on parenting, I find that my views and ideas sound like and seem to be coordinated well, resonating with Charles Eisenstein's ideas. And so I've been very happy to find his work just in this last year, and especially happy to be able to talk to him today. And perhaps this is even one of the benefits of the crisis or the confinement that we're in right now, that I'm able to meet and converse with Charles. So welcome, Charles.
Yeah, hi Polly. Yeah, great to talk to you again.
Yes, and to really meet you. So, you know, there are many topics that I'm eagerly looking forward to talking with you about, but I want to start with your background, because your views and your ideas often sound as though you're a Buddhist practitioner. And of course, I'm a longtime Buddhist practitioner, but I understand you are not. So I wonder how you came to this view that our main human problem is separation from our direct experience, from others, and from our surroundings. Did that line of thinking come from any particular experience, or were there a number of experiences? How did you come to that perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't count myself a Buddhist, although having marinated in Taiwan for 9 years of my life, I definitely absorbed some Buddhism and a lot of Taoism as well. But to answer your question, I held a question in my mind for a long time, which was something like, what's the origin of the wrongness in the world? As I came to understand, you know, even as a teenager or even younger than that, it wasn't well articulated, but like I knew that it wasn't supposed to be this way. I knew I wasn't supposed to hate Monday and to look forward to weekends and the summer and get a little bit of freedom, you know. And then as I learned more about the world, I knew that the rainforests weren't supposed to be getting cut down, and species weren't supposed to be going extinct, and human beings shouldn't be exploiting and enslaving each other, and that this isn't just the inevitable human condition, but that it could be different. And so I became really curious, why is it like this? And in my 20s, cycled through various reasons, various offerings, explanations, why we are in such a state, and none of them were satisfying. Ultimately, I flirted with various of them, you know, Marxism, for example, but I wasn't satisfied with any. And then the key moment came when I was maybe around 30, 31, 32. I had moved back to the United States then to raise my children, and I had this idea of suburbia where there's going to be packs of kids roaming around and playing. And we bought a house in a neighborhood where there were lots of young families, lots of kids, but no one was ever outside. And it didn't take me long to figure out why. The blue glow emanating from every living room, that was part of the explanation. The automobile culture where nothing is actually sourced locally, the dissolving of community. And I'm like, this is a kind of separation that, and where did it begin? It's inseparable from our from our whole civilization, from the money system that requires endless growth, from our conception of who we are. So I'm like, oh, this is a kind of separation. And the domination and conquest of nature, that's another kind of separation. And like every problem I looked at, I could frame in terms of the story that who we are discrete, separate individuals in a world of other. Even taking it back to the mentality of technology and science, the idea of progress as an ascent in our ability to exercise control over the world. Yeah.
It's interesting in a way because I had as a very young child the question of what's going on here anyway, because I could see that the people around me were suffering a great deal, but they didn't talk about it. I grew up in a working class environment. There was a lot of domestic violence. I was a very introverted kid who was kind of watching all of that. But I think, in some ways I came to Buddhism early. I was just like 22 years old. And it seemed to me to be the very first thing I ever met that really seemed to give an experiential answer to my question of what's going on here. Well, partly what I came to, and it's also this story of separation, but that the human being, the Homo sapien, develops in such a way that is a necessary development of separating the self, the inside from the outside. And then there's the feeling I'm in here and the world is out there. And then all civilizations and all cultures have to kind of deal with that gap because it feels as though I am vulnerable. I'm in here by myself, and a lot of people feel like I'm in here and nobody even knows who I am, because I'm so different or unique or whatever. And the world is out there. And over time, I've kind of come at that problem or issue from different perspectives. But right now, what strikes me in this period of time, and has been for quite a while, is the polarization of, really the culture that surrounds me. I mean, things have been, repetitively conflicted, repetitively war-oriented for a long time for North Americans. But the polarization in the sort of general public domain is more acute than I ever remember it. And that's kind of led me to feel like we don't get along as a species. It's like we can't agree about anything, and we won't be able to solve the rainforest, the automobile, the technology, that or the money or anything unless we can talk to each other, unless we can work with each other. And that alienation from other human beings is right now striking me, that it's very difficult for us to get together and talk about what's going on. But I got there through the route of developmental psychology. I'm a developmental psychologist, and Buddhism. And you got there apparently through the route of just observing your own experience and seeing what it's like to come back from China to America allowed you to see something in a fresh light.
I could also talk about the impact that psychedelics had on me in my early 20s. And in general, the bankruptcy of the mythology that I had grown up in, which with its prescriptions of how to live, how to be a man, how to do this thing called life. It was much harder to believe in it than it was in my parents' generation.
Yes.
Yeah. And today, like the polarization you're talking about, I think is in large part a symptom of this accelerated breakdown of our systems of meaning and the identity that goes along with them.
Yes, and absolutely.
It's also a symptom of the erosion of identity that is a consequence of the loss of community and the loss of connection. Because really, to know who you are as more than a narrow, separated individual, you have to be in in intimate, multidimensional relationships
Yes.
with people and other beings.
Yes.
And we kind of don't have that now. You know, it's just shrunk to the nuclear family. But if we were living in Stone Age times, or in a traditional village or an indigenous tribe or something, like most of the people that you ever saw would know you so thoroughly that there's no question of pretense. There's no question of hiding. There's no question of, you know, this feeling of alienation. Who am I really? And no one else knows who I am really, and no one else sees me. This was not an issue nearly as much. Now, there's still a process of individuation and then the dilation of the self. That's part of normal human development. But the conditions that we are in stymie that developmental process, abrogate the initiations that are supposed to happen post-adolescence, and keep us trapped in this adolescent, highly individuated state that never has a chance to crack and expand our beingness to include our relationships. And the same thing, you know, true for humanity in general, for civilization in general, stuck in this adolescent state of separation from nature. I could go on with that, but that's the, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a term that, you know, that comes particularly from a psychoanalyst that is called mature dependence. And it means that you're dependent in a mature way. And the adolescent earlier aspect is an anxious independence. And it seems to me that, you know, many people are stuck in an anxious independence. The first state is an immature dependence, you know, where you haven't yet actually taken responsibility for your life. But, you know, things of what you're saying, of course, I'm in a slightly different generation from you. My children are younger than you, but they probably would say some of the same kinds of things you're saying. And I think that there was a breakdown of community that occurred in the period of time from the time I was a child until my midlife, you know, and the community breakdown was around this general notion of safetyism. That's what Jonathan Haidt calls it. You know, it's just that people became more and more anxious about their safety. And so there was less and less opportunity for children, for example, to run around together. And of course, in my childhood, you know, I had to come home when the streetlights came on. I mean, that was the rule. And otherwise, we were out and about. There was a group of us and we had our dogs with us and so on. And of course, even in my own children's childhood, things started changing and there was anxiety. And now I have grandchildren, and now especially during this confinement, this shutdown, my 5-year-old grandchild is not going to go to kindergarten. He lives in Ottawa, and he's going to stay at home and have some remote kindergarten. I mean, you know, you'd have to remote kindergarten. But the idea that we are now in, you know, more separation, more anxiety, more safetyism than we were 6 months ago, you know, it's almost impossible for me to believe it. I mean, it's like I thought things had reached their ultimate of this kind of anxious sort of separation. And now I realize that even, you know, a lot of my friends and peers and fellow Buddhists are all sort of shut down in their homes, and there are plenty of people that aren't seeing their friends, even though here in Vermont, where I live, you know, there hasn't been a new death from the virus all summer. And the numbers are so small that the probability of being with an infected person is less than getting struck by lightning. But most people don't know that. You know, they don't check in on it. They don't look at it. It's as though their motivation is so strongly towards something that, you know, this sort of be safe idea, that they haven't even looked at what are the parameters that they're operating by. that are called safety. You know?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I have a comment about that. I think that you have identified a really deep core issue when you're talking about safety. And the separate self is fundamentally insecure.
Yes.
Because if you are just the separate self, then if you die, then that's the end of the universe, basically. Right. If you understand yourself and experience yourself as not just a separate individual, then death takes on a very different meaning. Yes. If you understand your purpose here as to contribute something beautiful to the world, then death is not the ultimate catastrophe.
Right.
In Darwinian biology, if the old paradigm of evolutionary biology, death is the ultimate catastrophe for your selfish genes. Mm-hmm. In economic teaching, where human beings seek to maximize rational self-interest, again, death is the ultimate catastrophe. If you believe yourself as a separate psychology, like a bubble of psychology in a flesh robot that only exists as a psychology because of the flesh robot, then again, death is the ultimate catastrophe. So there's this underlying horror, this dread that's built into the separate self. Now, it's not usually conscious, explicit, that that's what we're afraid of, but it's underlying everything. So when something comes along, terrorism or COVID, it's almost a relief, because now the inchoate dread has an object to focus on. And it seems then that if you can only control this threat, then you will live forever. Then everything is okay. So there's a relief in having an identifiable enemy to conquer.
Yeah, yeah. And putting on the mask seems like a simple idea of control. You know, right. I mean, even though it's a completely irrational thing, I think that there's a way that it brings a sense of control that responds to the anxiety. And I agree with you. I think the anxiety, though, does reside very specifically with death. And that, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, I'm very much, I wouldn't even say a believer. I'm completely convinced about rebirth. And I've just had enough experiences of the continuity of consciousness with people dying, watching, you know, my late husband had early onset Alzheimer's. And so by the time he died, he had no cortex. But when he was actually in the process of dying, he was conscious. And so it very clearly showed me that consciousness does not depend on the cerebral cortex. And so, you know, if we could engage with death from the perspective of it being part of the adventure of life, because life and death are bound together. From the moment you start existing, you start dying, and you're also at risk of dying. And so, you know, you cannot be in life without also being in death. And then the way that our society has organized the fear of dying and the fear of death is that we've separated out people who are dying from the people who are living. At least we try. And so there are many individuals, people that I see in therapy, who've never seen someone die. And then if they're old and they're looking at their own deaths, it's like going to another planet, you know, that they've never seen it. And so they then, I think, have fantasies of it being ultimate separation, just going into the darkness. You know, it seems very frightening. They project into it a kind of boogeyman, you know, from childhood. Yeah.
And also, like, the dominant religion of our time, which is science, tells us that. And that if you believe in near-death experiences, you know, and the continuity of the soul and reincarnation, then you're just being irrational. You're being unscientific.
Right.
And you just can't take the grim truth of total annihilation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The sort of, you know, there was this, there is this odd thing about death when it comes to science, because there's no science that demonstrates that there's a single birth and a single death. there's quite a lot of scientific evidence now for reincarnation. There are a few people that have done a lot of research, and also on near-death experiences, the rescue medicine people. There's a lot of research in the continuity of consciousness after death from people that have been brought back from a death experience, and then from the people that have been doing the research on reincarnation. So there is scientific evidence for reincarnation. There's no scientific evidence for a single birth and a single death. And yet people will argue, well, that's not scientific. Because again, I think that we base this idea of science also on some kind of narrative of separation, that the
Yes.
subject and object kind of separation.
Well, science actually is a word that brings together a lot of things under one umbrella.
Yeah. Right.
There's the scientific method, there's the culture of science, there are scientific institutions, there's even a metaphysical basis of science that's rarely talked about.
Right.
But assumptions like the assumption that everything can be quantified.
Yeah.
That if it's real, then you can measure it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
The assumption of causal determinism, that things only happen if they're made to happen. This is actually false in quantum mechanics.
Right.
But the basic mindset of science is analytic. It's reductionistic. It's like, okay, this caused that caused that caused that, and therefore things can't just happen. And therefore, and that the universe is essentially random.
Yeah.
I mean, these are all deep-set metaphysical assumptions that underlie the religion of science. And if you accept those,
yeah, I was going to say they're all pretty much based on also the separation of the subject and the object. So once the observational issue comes in, like who is, actually writing down that data? I mean, data don't just occur by themselves, and scientific experiments are always being done by human beings, and so there's always that aspect of human consciousness in it. And of course, uncertainty principle and other things have come into our highest sciences now to change the perspective. And there's plenty out there. As you said, science is a very big term. There's plenty out there to demonstrate the subject and the object are not separated in the way that, many ordinary people think. And perhaps, even somebody like Descartes, who gets blamed a lot for that, actually had a pretty big religious belief behind what he was doing. So yes, it's the religion of science and the drive to control and to predict that seems to me to be part of what makes people so afraid right now, but also afraid of dying. Like you said, if it's just the end, like the end of the movie, and then there's nothing. Honestly, I think that probably, even in itself, shouldn't be that frightening. But it's that we project, because if there's nothing, there's nothing. Why would you be frightened of it? But we project into that nothingness all of the scary experiences of separation. The experiences that we had as children. So, I mean, I really very much agree with your worldview that this separation issue is at the crux of what is really wrong with, many, let's say, aspects of, I'm going to say North American culture, because, when you go to Asia, or it's not that there aren't things wrong with other cultures, there are, but not the same things that, that are wrong for people here. And I wondered if we could switch gears a little bit, because I want to talk to you about gift economy. I want to talk to you about the fact that at this moment, something is changing in relation to money and economies. We don't know where it's going. But I mean, there's one sort of hypothesis that we could be forced now into a kind of digital currency, because we're being forced to use technology. And to really, in my line of work, psychotherapy, I would never have imagined I would be doing therapy on Zoom. I would have thought that to be unethical. but now people want that, you know? And so I assume that more and more people are sort of accommodating to the idea of digital currency. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, but then also your thoughts about the gift economy and how that might, I don't know if you feel that there's a chance that things could evolve to support, you know, your vision of more sort of sacred economics.
Okay, well, those are some big topics.
Yeah.
As far as digital currencies goes, one thing we have to recognize is that we're already using digital currency. The totalitarian implications of it have already happened. Every transaction is visible to the government.
And recorded, yeah.
And recorded, yeah. You know, cash transactions are an insignificant part of the economy, even before COVID.
Yeah.
So, you know, to me, there are legitimate questions here. Basically, it comes down to wealth and commerce. Who gets to see what's going on? Right now, actually, transactions are pretty much invisible to everybody but the government.
Right.
And the financial institutions, which are actually an arm of the government in some sense, right. The power structures, the corporatocracy. In a traditional society, wealth was totally visible. It was impossible to hide it in a bank account. Because if you were wealthy, it means you had a lot of land, you had a lot of cattle. You know, it was obvious that you were wealthy, and that meant that you couldn't escape the responsibilities and expectations and the duties of wealth. So, and those were many. You know, if you wanted to be a king, you had, or a chief or a big man, you had to have sumptuous feasts all the time and give gifts and so forth. So you were actually, to a large degree, a nexus for the flow of wealth. In a hunter-gatherer society, that was even more true. In Sacred Economics, I quote some anthropology where the anthropologist is quizzing Kalahari San about their concept of wealth. And he says, well, you have a word for wealth, for precious objects, kai. Kai means like shiny things and you know, rare things. And a kai-ha is, we translate that as a wealthy man. So a kai-ha, is that somebody who has a lot of kai in his hut? And the informant says, no, having a lot of kai does not make you a kai-ha. We call somebody a kai-ha when he makes a lot of kai flow. So he's kind of like a master of kai. He's the guy who hooks people up with, and is
like the rainmaker kind of guy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that person would have many of the attributes of our current archetype of the rich man, like social respect, influence, and a certain kind of affluence. Like people are going to give to him, and he's going to, but he has a responsibility then to find a channel to give it out again. So when I talk about sacred economics, one of the questions is, how do we create that in a mass economy with a high degree of division of labor, where things are not so visible in a small community, but we have a global coordination of labor that's necessary to produce technology and to, you know, whether or not you think that's desirable, that's where we are right now. So I don't think right now I want to go too much into the details of like what policies and monetary designs would bring that element of gift culture to money, but that's the motivating spirit.
Yes, and even what you've said so far, you know, I think when I was growing up, I thought, and I was quite an innocent child growing up in Akron, Ohio, and I hadn't traveled but I assumed that wealthy people had a lot of responsibility, that they had this kind of responsibility to give back. And I must have heard, I don't know if it was, you know, one of the Rockefellers or somebody give a speech at some point that gave me that idea. And I thought of royalty that way. I thought that these people are not just sort of free to sort of run around and enjoy their privilege or to, just sort of grow in their power, but that they were actually in a position of grave responsibility, that they had to think often and always about how much they'd been given, so how much they had to give back. And that whole idea seems to have been, something that disappeared really in my young adult years. I mean, I don't see, wealthy people thinking in those terms anymore. And so whatever that sort of, that's probably, like you said, a kind of an archetype of a certain kind of king, some kind of noble being that is elevated in this way in order to provide back what has been given. And I don't think that we, see wealth being used that way anymore. I can't tell, if we're moving towards an economy where there's universal basic income. I'm not sure that I think that's a really good thing for human development, but I don't know how, it's hard to say. It's as though the importance of the consumer sort of evaporated too recently. I think people thought they counted because they were keeping the retail stores going or the restaurants going or whatever, and all of these places are closing. And it seems as though we don't even count as consumers now. So it's not just that the wealthy don't count, but the consumer in some ways. I feel like there's a way in which this recent shift has also shifted away from a consumer culture, but in a weird way. It's like, I'm not buying much stuff at all because I'm not going anywhere and I'm not traveling. But at the same time, there's something going on that it isn't exactly ideal. I don't feel relaxed about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
A lot of things are happening at once.
A lot of things are happening. And I don't know, do you see a promise in any of this? I want to go on to talk to you about coronation, but do you see a promise in what's happening, with the world economy or with the sort of technological takeover of things? Do you see something that might look promising in terms of spiritual development out there or psychological promise?
Yeah, there's, I think, well, one promising thing is that a lot of people are growing their own food now. People who, have never had a garden before are planting gardens.
That's true.
And that's probably the most promising thing that I see happening.
I see.
The movement to relocalize our food supply. The problem with the universal basic income, which is, it definitely has some appeal, and I think overall it's a good idea. But the problem, of course, is that it generates, if it corresponds to the mass destruction of small business and employment, then you become dependent on the state for your monthly pittance, which is then conditioned on your good behavior.
That's right. That's right. That's what I would worry about. And I would worry about also the destruction of, so I live in central Vermont, and there are a lot of gardens here. A lot of people do grow their food, and there are a lot of local farms. There's an economy that is pretty local. And I see how it's been wiped out already. As far, we're not very far into this shutdown, and there are so many places that are closed. There are so many places that I really enjoyed going, and every day I went to a certain cafe, even though I live out in the country. I'd drive into town so I could see friends there, and and that cafe is open, but just for takeout now. And so there are many things that aren't working.
So this shutdown, I mean, and the whole coronavirus phenomenon. One thing, this is what I wrote about a bit in The Coronation, is that it's places at a crossroads where so much has been shut down, so much has been taken away from us, that it gives us the opportunity to ask, for one thing, to value the things that have been lost because we've lost them. It's like, you know, when a loved one passes, you realize how valuable they were.
Right.
When you're sick, you realize how valuable health is.
Right.
If you can't breathe, if the air is full of smoke, you know, you value fresh air again. When the cafes all close down, when you can't gather with people, then you understand how valuable that was, how precious it was, even to see other human faces in public,
Right.
that aren't masked. Okay, so we're being asked, okay, what that we do not have anymore, do we actually really want to reclaim, and what can we let go of? No, like for me, jetting around the country or around the world, speaking at conferences, like I can let go of that. You know, I mean, you know, online conferences don't have that element of the random encounter between sessions in the hallway and the cafeteria, like that kind of synchronicity. So there is definitely a place for, I call them synchronicity generators. And as far as festivals go, oh my God, I mean, this is one of the things. Do we want to have a future where we've decided that it's just too dangerous ever to gather for a music festival or for a wedding or for a dance party?
Right.
Like, I mean, this, you know, different people have different views. Some people would say, yeah, we need to be safer. Even if COVID disappears, you can get the flu, you know, even the common colds, you know, kill some people, especially old people, and it can spread to them. And like, you can have reasons that are not even dependent on COVID-19 to maintain lockdown forever. But but what I'm saying is that we are being asked a question we've never been asked before, because up until now, we've taken for granted the direction of society toward more and more control, more and more safety, more and more separation. And now we're being shown like a preview of the destination to which we've been headed. And we're being asked, do we really want that? And what are we willing to sacrifice? If we do not want that, are we willing to be maybe a little bit less healthy? Although that also, I mean, ultimately, we're not going to be more healthy by cutting ourselves off from each other.
No, I mean, immunity actually depends on interaction with our species. You know?
Right.
And so the idea of isolation was never really the idea connected to health. So, you know, I think you're right about, you know, the questions you ask. I'm just going to read a little passage from the coronavirus that I had written out, that do we want to wear masks in public all the time? Do we want to be medically examined every time we travel, if that will save some numbers of lives a year? Are we willing to accept the medicalization of life in general, handing over final sovereignty over our bodies to medical authorities as selected by political ones? Do we want every event to be a virtual event? How much do we want to live in fear? It's not hard to imagine, especially if social distancing is successful, that COVID-19 persists beyond the 18 months we're told to expect it to run its course. It's not hard to imagine that new viruses emerge during that time. It's not hard to imagine that emergency measures will become normal, just as the state of emergency declared after 9/11 is still in effect today. And it's not hard to imagine that reinfection is possible, so that the disease will never run its course. That means that the temporary changes in our way of life might become permanent. Well, we're 6 months into it. You wrote that in April, or maybe even March, I'm not sure.
Yeah, March.
And we're 6 months into this now, and it looks like these changes are not going away. You know, here in Vermont, we were told 2 months to flatten the curve. The curve has been flat for a while now, quite a while, and there's no change in, you know, what we're allowed or not allowed to do. There's a little bit of relaxing on the number of people that can gather inside, but they have to wear masks. So you know, when you say we're being asked these questions about what we consider valuable, I mean, I have absolutely no question about what I consider valuable. I believe that contact with my species and being able to get together with my friends and having my grandchildren be able to go to school and be with their friends and so on, I think that's beyond precious. I mean, I think it's always been the stuff of what it means to be, you know, a social being, which is what.
But Polly, people are going to die if you do that. You care more about your personal freedom and children going to kindergarten than people dying. I mean,
well,
that's what we have. That's the argument that we have to.
And people die from downhill skiing and ice climbing, and people die from driving their cars. And, you know, I mean, it's before this particular moment, I've never heard anybody say, I'm not going to do backcountry skiing because a lot of people die in the backcountry skiing. You know, it just wasn't even in part of the reasoning. In other words, risk taking and engagement with life.
Right, but what people would say is that it's not your risk, it's you're putting other people at risk by not abiding by the rules.
Yes, and so I want to get into more of a conversation about that, because, you know, I see so many of these placards that say we believe in science. You know, they say things like we believe in love, we believe in science, Black Lives Matter, and all this. I always wonder, the we believe in science thing always gets me, but the fact is, will we be able to choose to be able to congregate and to be our natural social selves? Will that be a choice that we can make, or has that choice been taken away already?
Well, I mean, when I say it's a choice, like, I'm not saying it's going to automatically be granted to us if we decide that we want it. We have to actually claim it through a political process. And as far as this whole thing about, you know, you're going to put other people at risk and so forth, really what comes up is conflicting values within society. Nobody would want to shut down all of society if it would save one person.
That's right.
Right? But probably even you would agree to quarantine and lockdown if we had the Black Death killing 60% of the population.
Sure. Like, even Ebola, even if it wasn't killing 60%, if Ebola were around because of the way it acts and how quickly it acts and how destructive it is, yes, it would be valuable.
Okay, so those are two extremes, two poles. We're somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
So basically, to me, it comes down to our original topic. Why do we value risk minimization so highly among the multitude of values that every human being holds? Why has this one become paramount? And I think it comes down to the separate self, the program of control, the fear of death, the idea that underlies technological utopianism, that we make the world a better and better place by exerting more and more precise control over the microbial world, over the material world, and that someday we'll be able to even manage our body chemistry, our brain chemistry. You'll never have to be sad. You'll never have to suffer. We're going to engineer all suffering out of existence through precise control of all beings. And as long as and that's an extreme version of what in the essay I call the civilizational tilt toward control. Anyone immersed in that, if they're in government, if they're Bill Gates, they don't have to be a nefarious villain to celebrate the next advance in our ability to control the world, whether it's through surveillance, whether it's through, you know, implanted microchips or whatever, because control is how good things happen. It's what raised us from being wild animals at the constant mercy of nature, barely struggling to survive, to the safe, comfortable lives that we have today. And so this whole narrative, you know, depends actually on ignoring a lot of important information. Like, was hunter-gatherer life actually this tooth and nail, desperate struggle to survive and miserable? Well, no, in fact, it wasn't. In fact, every building block of this narrative has cracks in it. But
Right.
that's the story that people are immersed in. And it's not only a story, it also corresponds to an economic situation, a social situation, like, and a psychological situation. It corresponds to the response to trauma that,
Mm-hmm.
that people, that is rife in our society, both, full-blown trauma that we recognize, but also the muted trauma of, for example, having ties develop with your daycare provider as you're 2 years old, and you attach to this person, and then you move to another center the next year, and that teacher gets fired, and you make a new tie, and then that gets broken, and then you have your teacher, and then that gets broken. And then your family moves, and that gets, that tie gets broken. And we don't recognize how wounded we are. And so that breaking of ties, that repeated breaking of ties, and the failure of ties to even be developed in the first place, to be alienated from the outdoors.
Right.
Like that is the experiential correlate to the story of separation that tilts our civilization toward more and more control. And if that doesn't change, then whether it's through the war on terror or the war on COVID-19 or the war on this or the war on that, we're always going to be acting from that fundamental insecurity.
Well, that the point that you're making, it has a lot of levels in it, obviously. I find that control, the idea of control and the desire to be in control, is the major thing that I treat in psychotherapy. It covers everything from eating disorders and anxieties about your health, to relational problems trying to control your partner, to issues that people have about their identities, wanting to control how other people perceive them and talk to them, and so on. And that idea of control is a fairly new development in my world of psychotherapy. I'd say it's about 15 years old. It wasn't really around. Something changed. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what you think changed, but I want to add one other piece to this first, that a few years ago, I'd say it's maybe now 4 or 5 years ago, I was on a panel at the Helix Foundation in New York, and it was on immortality. Now, I got invited to that panel by accident, one of those synchronous things that you were talking about. I was at a dinner party in New York. There were people talking about this panel, and somebody said, we really need somebody like a Buddhist or something who doesn't really believe that, immortality is a good idea. And I said, hey, I love mortality. I mean, I'm into mortality. I like the fact that we have a limited lifespan, and I like the whole thing. And they said, well, would you like to come and be our Buddhist speaker on this panel? The panel freaked me out. I honestly didn't know about transhumanism. I didn't know what was happening in the world of cryogenics, I don't even want to go into all the detail of it, but there were a lot of people, I would say roughly your age. In fact, a lot of people. On the panel, there were, I think, 8 of us, and the rest of them were men. I was the only woman. I was the oldest person, and I was the only person who didn't believe that immortality would be a really wonderful thing if human beings could achieve it. Everybody else, and some of them, there was a physicist, there was a kind of cultural commentator. I don't remember the people's names anymore, but I was really shocked by this narrative. And then I began to look into it. And then I began to see how widespread it is and how the technology is really developing. That, the idea of extending, they were saying at least to extend the lifespan to 150 years, but then they hope to sort of bootstrap that further, so that there might be the possibility for immortality. And pretty much every one of the speakers started out by saying, I would love to live forever. I love myself. I love my life, and I would like to live forever. And I started out by saying, it would be ridiculous to me to think I'd be Polly Young-Eisendrath forever. I'm looking to get out of that fairly soon. It's been nice, But, you know, I'm very happy with this framework that we have of nature and cycles and time as we understand it, which is that there's a kind of renewal through a cycle. And, but it was really surprising to me. And then I began to see what was actually happening in the transhumanism movement. And I think it goes beyond control. You know, I think it is the desire for immortality, and that's always been around. I mean, since ancient cultures, Gilgamesh is about the desire for immortality. But I do think right now, it's got a handle connected to fear and control.
Yes. Well, the desire for immortality, that's the ultimate expression of conquest and domination. It's to conquer death itself.
Yeah.
They're going to have a really unpleasant surprise coming from them, for them, to the extent that they succeed. Because what they're...
I don't think they'll succeed, but anyway, go ahead.
Right. For one thing, the generosity of the universe is such that our bodies are designed or have evolved to give us the lifespan that is necessary to live a complete human life at this stage of human development. So you have your adolescence, you have your first love, you know, you have your ambitious 20s, you have your family, you have your period of stability, you have grandkids, you know, you have all the different initiations of a lifespan, ending with your great-grandchild on your knee. Like that's kind of as long as you need to live. That's
the ultimate, yeah.
A dog doesn't need to live that long to have a full experience of dog, and that's why their lifespan's 12 years.
Right.
A rabbit, you know, to do everything a rat, right? So until our society and our species changes to a point where a full human lifespan requires more years, none of these technologies are really going to work. To the extent that they do work, but that's the good scenario. The bad scenario is they do work and you end up imprisoned in the hell of a self that's become too small for you.
That's exactly what I think is the more likely outcome, because even as I look at the technologies and I look at AI and I look at the robotics and so on, I don't have the same impression that a lot of people have about what could be developed. I'm much more on the side of, say, somebody like a Donald Hoffman than I am on the side of somebody, like a Bill Gates or the transhumanism people or whatever. I actually think that robots are not conscious. And I think AI will never be conscious. And I think it won't be conscious because consciousness is not predetermined. It is not a deterministic system. It's like life. It's an open-ended system. Whereas I think anything that is robotic cannot move to the point of non-determinism. So I don't feel like there's a great chance of this generation of Silicon Valley guys making immortality a main thing. But I think that the movement towards exerting that kind of control is possible, and that people do fall for the fear for the reason you're saying. They're afraid of death. You know, they're afraid of actually their own, let's say, limitedness. And it's because somehow as a culture, and I don't think this is worldwide, but I think that we've developed a kind of ideal about control, about purity, about staying safe that wasn't around when I was growing up or even when I was a young adult. And I feel like that has something to do with overparenting. I think you feel it may have something to do with something much bigger. But you know, what I've seen in my own life is feminism. You know, I'm a feminist. I was in the 70s kind of feminism, really interested in women opening up their lives and being able to succeed at using their intelligence. And I figured they could figure out the child rearing thing along the way, you know, that we can work it out with our partners or whatever. But what happened instead was that as many of the people that I see in therapy got better and better educated and more capable, the women, they decided, oh, I want to put this into being a mother. And so then they took all of this intelligence and all of this PhD study, and they stopped working, or they worked part-time, and they focused on this 1 or 2 children thing. And then they were controlling everything, you know. And here in Vermont, it looked like this. I have to sew my kids' Halloween costume. Everything has to be organic. My child needs to be accompanied door to door on trick or treat. And I will be there every step of the way, and I will be the witness to what my child does. And so it became a kind of, I think, like a very intelligent, obsessional kind of mothering. And I do think that has led to some of this hyper control stuff, and that the over-parenting around the idea of not just keeping my child safe, but making my child a genius, you know, making my child the first one to do A, B, or C. I think that has contributed a lot to this desire for control and the fear of danger, and also perhaps even, you know, the idea that we could somehow control the body enough to make it immortal. But I think you have a different idea about what brought about our current sort of obsession with safety.
Well, I think what you're describing is part of the picture. And I think what you're describing is just as much a symptom as a cause of the trend toward control that we see. It actually, I think it goes back many thousands of years and has intensified with the evolution of technology and the co-evolution of society with technology. And on a deep level, it's again baked into the scientific cake that, and this is actually much bigger than science, but the location of intelligence in the human being alone, the location of beingness in the human being alone, right, means that and to believe that the world does not possess its own beingness, its own sentience, its own consciousness, its own, you said, you know, AI or robots are not conscious. And I'm like, well, maybe everything's conscious.
Yeah, I'm
anyway,
not. No, I mean, I know what you're saying, and I wouldn't confine consciousness to human beings by any means, but I was excluding machines. Yeah.
Right. So okay. So if we take that for granted, then progress means imposing intelligence onto a world that has none, bringing consciousness onto a dead automaton, and it means also that because the world outside of ourselves, it's these random forces, it's these competing other beings, so they don't care about us. The sun is only shining on the earth and nourishing life because of a series of incredibly lucky coincidences. But we don't see that the sun, we don't understand in our culture that the sun wants to nourish life on earth, that it wants to give these gifts. That's not a scientifically formulable concept. That would be called anthropomorphic projection for a scientist. So the same thing then, when we understand that we are part of a much larger intelligence, then what becomes important is our participation in that intelligence. Because we know that we are here for a purpose, not just to survive and reproduce. So even accepting that immersion and entanglement in a larger purpose and intelligence and consciousness reduces the fear of death.
Yeah.
And we no longer want to, because if there isn't any of that, then what meaning is there in life? There isn't any. So you might as well just look out for yourself, look out for your children, maximize your chance of survival, minimize your risk, maximize your safety and your comfort. But if you are, and this is how people behave when they're not aligned with a purpose. But if you have a cause or an aim in life that they care about, they'll sacrifice their lives for that cause.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So when we're alienated from that on like a metaphysical, conceptual level, but also on a personal level, then we enact it in our parenting. And it becomes more important for the kids to survive. Like that becomes so overridingly important that we don't value the, say, the development of capacities that will enable them to contribute to the unfolding of life and beauty in the universe. And, because but on some level we know that there are more important things in life than surviving it. And in fact, you can't survive it. Only if you believe in immortality and live in denial of death, can you even imagine or pretend that you can survive life. So I think that what you're talking about, like, yes, the overparenting, the protectiveness, I mean, it is incredibly damaging. You like just barely touched on how damaging it is. Because, for example, what you're telling a child when you're hovering over them and protecting them from every risk is that you are incapable. You are not trustworthy. The world is dangerous. And you're actually and if they never bump their head, they never learn that head bumps hurt. They never learn to be careful. They never learn to master their world if they're being protected all the time. So this is one of the most disturbing things for me about our society is that like the freedom to be a child, if you give that to your children, CPS comes and takes your children away. It's that bad. I know parents who have had that happen because their children were playing in the park across the street.
Yeah, no, I've heard Jonathan Haidt talk about it too, in terms of free range kids and so on, and, allowing his kids to be on the subway in New York when they were 9 years old by themselves and having to attach a little note to them to say to the policeman, you could call me up and my son has my permission to be out here. I wonder if you think, though, I think about this a lot, that my generation walked away from the churches, the temples, the religion, the traditional religions. We pretty much shed those if we were, supposedly educated and so on. I mean, there are certainly people in my generation who practice evangelical Christianity, who practice, various kinds of Judaism as well as Buddhism, of course. But I think in walking away from religions, we walked into something that we were not aware of, that these religious communities, churches, synagogues, provided something that was much larger than just a sort of set of rules. They were, in fact, communities. There were traditions. There were stories. And the stories were almost all about the things you were talking about, having a purpose in life, a bigger purpose than just yourself, that you're here to devote yourself to something that's much bigger than you, that the life is not about your identity, and that there were rules like the Ten Commandments or the Golden Rule that were meant to be followed in a general way. So, sometimes I think that walking away from all of that actually also introduced more anxiety for the individual ego, because now parents had to raise their children without the help of a larger group of people saying, hey, there's a bigger purpose here. And what it comes down to, honestly, is, the idea of always asking your kid, what do you want to do now? Or what are you interested in? Or, down to even gender inquiry. What gender do you think you are? I mean, it's way too much anxiety back into the kid who doesn't know, and would have, under other circumstances, be walking into a tradition that said, okay, you're going to get initiated to do this, and now you're going to get initiated to do that. And there would have been a sort of general flow with a community and a support for that. So I often think about the fact that, middle-class educated people walked away from structured religion not so long ago, and that increased a lot of anxiety about purpose in life, and also about safety and why you should take risks and what you should sacrifice and who you should sacrifice for and so on.
Yes. Traditional religions are themselves a mix of separation and interbeing.
Yeah.
So what people don't realize is that stepping out of those religions, they've stepped into another religion.
Yes,
which,
right.
might be called science, but it also has economic and political dimensions.
Right.
We don't recognize it as a religion, but in fact, as I was saying before, it has these metaphysical foundations. You mentioned some of them too. Objectivity for one. It has a priesthood. It has its own sacred texts. It has its martyred saints. It has its evangelists. It has its rituals. It has a system for indoctrinating youth. It has schisms and heretics. It has, excommunication. If you deviate from dogma, your funding gets cut off. I mean, it has the entire apparatus of a religion. It tells us how the world began, tells us what the purpose of life is, tells us what a human being is. It gives us a path to knowledge. The royal road to truth. I mean, people don't realize that we are still in a religion, and that this religion embodies separation. In fact, one reason it is successful is that it is part of the ascent of separation. And this is part on a collective level, maybe to take a little bit of positivity from this, maybe we are, in fact, fulfilling the individuation process on a species level, and now entering a coming of age initiation that cracks us open and brings us to the place of mature dependency, where we no longer imagine ourselves to be independent of the rest of life, but know ourselves to be dependent and see ourselves as contributors, full members of the tribe, as it were. A full member of the tribe doesn't just take from the tribe like a child does. That's immature dependency, but it also gives. And I think we see signs of this awakening, like in the regenerative agriculture movement, for example, the ecosystem restoration movement, to we want to contribute to the unfolding of life and beauty. That's why every species is here. The history of life on Earth is a history of more and more complexity, more and more diversity, more and more complex ecosystems, more and more life. Going back, the multicellular organism, that increased the amount of life. The flowering plant, that was only a few tens of millions of years old. And now we're born here, as all species were born, to bring yet a new layer of complexity and life here. And we haven't done that yet. We've been gestating, we've been immature, but maybe now, as we fulfill and explore the extremes of separation and feel confined, like there's no more room, it's not exciting anymore. As it was when I was a kid still, like the conquest of space, that lit my fire, and every other young person. What's the last frontier, the next frontier? No one's excited about that anymore.
Right.
I mean, how many people are excited about a mission to the moon, a mission to Mars? No one. Like, we're not, like, already the collective psyche is turning toward, looking toward and wanting, yearning for to enter the mature state of service. And that's why people are, so many people facing the crisis, the archetypal crisis, the apocalypse, Y2K, peak oil, climate change, financial collapse. Like, there's a certain amount of glee, like welcome.
There's excitement,
Like I kind of,
because it seems like an adventure again. I mean, it seems like there's something to be. You know, I mean, I think that I agree with you about science turning into a religion. I don't think it's a necessity for science to turn into a religion, but I do think that it's a necessity for human beings to have a religion. I mean, you know, I'm a Jungian analyst. You've mentioned the term archetype many times in your lingo. I don't use the term so much because I feel like people don't really understand what it means. It's like a primary imprint. It's something that's given in the nature of things. And I do think that human beings are archetypally or naturally religious. I think that we need something that is bigger than the ego to believe in. And so one reason why I think science has moved into that view is because we've walked away from certain traditional religions, and that science and religion try to answer the same question. They try to answer the question, you know, what's the truth, or what's going on here? And I do think science does make room for argument and debate, and that there is something about science, when it's practiced well, the scientific method, that is unique about it and makes it really distinctive, and makes it clear also that what's going on right now is not science. And that's falsifiability. You know, in science, if you have a position or a hypothesis, you have to be able to falsify it as well as to demonstrate it or show it. And so much of what's going on in terms of our beliefs about COVID or wearing masks and so on, you know, can't be falsified. For example, I cannot say I am well, or I can't say, I can't falsify the statement I may be contagious. Because if I say to somebody, I'm well, they say you could be asymptomatic. That's why you have to wear the mask. But if I say, I haven't been exposed to anybody who is symptomatic in the last 2 weeks, which is the period of quarantine, so can I say I'm well then? Can I say, let's say I've had a COVID test a day ago. Can I say I'm well today? There's no time in this narrative of COVID that you can say you're well. So it's never falsifiable. There's never a time where you could falsify your contagion. So that's inherently unscientific. So, you know, within the scientific narrative, there is a process of testing and there is a process of debate. I don't think that most people who believe in science have any notion of that or what science is. Instead, I think they're engaging in what you're talking about, which is the desire to predict and control. And that's, you know, sort of separating ourselves out from a world that we think of as an object. And then we want to predict and control that world, or predict and control the resources. But let's say, you know, the idea that we may be breaking open to a new purpose, I think it would have to be a purpose that completely transcends the ego, that transcends this sense of self-conscious self-protection. You know, it would have to be something that takes us into, like you said, the new adventure. You know, what is the new adventure that actually brings new meaning to humanity, or to aspects of humanity? That new meaning would have to, it would have to in some way, in my mind, it has to have something to do with dropping the fear of death. That the new whatever is coming has to be a new engagement with the idea of death. In all of the belief systems that were around in traditional cultures and hunter-gatherers and all, there was always a transcendent aspect. And I don't think there was ever this, you know, tremendous fear of risk that we have right now. And so, I mean, I don't know the way you envision the cracking open, or how that would be a maturing. do you think just in the nature of the crisis that we're in?
I see two things coming together in this initiatory time. And it maps quite well onto coming of age initiations in traditional societies. One part is, so maybe the initiate is normally will be taken away from the village, taken away from familiar circumstances, and put in a completely new situation where, say it's a young man, where he does not know what to do, where none of his customary ways of being are sufficient to the task at hand, where he's not in control of things, and where his identity and his constructs no longer serve him and they fall apart. So he could be, you know, tied to a tree for 4 days or 7 days with no food and water. And maybe you're going to die, or maybe subjected to extreme fear and pain. Or maybe you have to take a massive dose of a psychedelic plant or something like that. So you're in a, you could look at it as a kind of a crisis. And I think that collectively, we are going through this process of the shattering of our identity, especially in America, but to some extent throughout the entire civilized world. We conceived ourselves to be no longer works. And maybe as the hammer blows of the challenges to our identity intensify, maybe one reaction is to cling all the more tightly to who we thought we were, make America great again, to cling to an imaginary past. But at some point, we can't maintain it anymore. And we are then birthed into a different self, collectively, a different story of the people that says why we're here, where we came from, where we're going. That's one aspect. Another aspect of maturation is falling in love and the experience of a different kind of love than the child's love for the mother. Child, it's an asymmetrical love for the mother. We receive, and whatever we give back is kind of token. You know, you might give your mother a Valentine's Day card or something like that as a little child, but really your job is to receive and to grow. And that's what humanity has done, or civilization has done. We've received, we've grown and grown and grown, and the mother provided all. And now we are as the individuation becomes complete, and we develop even a concept of nature as distinct from ourselves, which did not exist in traditional cultures. There was no separation that enabled nature to be conceptualized as an other. But as we become separate, we're able then to gaze at the beloved and to fall in love and to enter into a different kind of relationship where it's no longer about just taking, but also about giving, about co-creation. So it's like when you fall in love as a teenager, you know, or as a young adult. If you have gone through this initiation, you don't just want to take from that person. You know, you want to give a gift to the sweetie. You know, it's such a natural impulse. The first stirrings of romantic love, you want to give flowers, you want to give something. And then as the relationship progresses, you want to create together. You start dreaming together about the future. So this impulse is already awakening within civilization. This falling in love with the planet that really took on a new phase when the first photographs of Earth came down from space. You know, people fell in love with Earth. So this is the pull. We're being pulled toward that maturity, even as we're being pushed out of the womb of our childhood by the converging crises that form a birth crisis. In a way, now I'm mixing metaphors, coming of age or birth, but you know, just to say that these are two of the elements In birth, it's true too. The womb is expelling you. You cannot abide in the world that was familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also, when the cervix opens, there's also a light that you're moving toward. There's a hint that there's another
Mm-hmm.
world there.
Mm-hmm.
And we're having both in our time. The old world is becoming untenable, but we catch glimpses of our destination. Little, like, maybe you catch a glimpse in an encounter with holistic medicine or in a relationship or a community where people are really cooperating and you sense a possibility that feels
Mm-hmm.
real. That's not just an exception to grim normality, but it's real.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're getting both of these, the push and the pull are converging today.
And you think that this kind of transformation, well, a couple of things that I would say I'm sort of observing and hearing you speak, that a lot of the views of the whole earth and the views of species and the diversity and so on do come from scientific study. I mean, they do come from our ability really to have mastered certain kinds of studies of our environment. I mean, previously there just weren't those kinds of views. It wasn't
Okay, I mean, science,
things.
Science
So,
it is a way to see more
yes.
deeply. In fact, I think that's actually the higher purpose of science.
Mm-hmm.
But gotta be careful there because indigenous societies had an incredibly deep and sophisticated understanding of their environment.
Right. But it wasn't, it probably didn't include the whole earth view, that photograph that a lot of people could see. I mean, it's when you're there are different ways that we experience, obviously our environment. Science has brought about a certain kind of objectivity and a certain way of understanding. And it could be that what you're saying is that the aspects of science that have become, more dominant as a religion, where people just say, I believe in science, and they don't really understand what it is, that those aspects are cracking open.
I'm not saying science is a religion as a term of critique. I think religion is good. I want to embrace science as a religion. I want to recognize it as a religion and maybe approach it with the attitude of a religious reformer. Just like any other religion. It's only by taking science's view of religion and applying it to science that it becomes a term of critique. But I think it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful religion and powerful and sacred. And it has a core essence. Like each religion, as it comes onto the scene, brings a new unfolding of consciousness and a new medicine to the earth. And the core essence, the core spiritual principle of science is humility.
Yeah, it is. That's true. That's true. Because it's actually, there's always a new question. The questions cannot be fully answered. But just to take a step back to what you were saying previously, that if we're entering into some kind of new paradigm in which there is which we've seen sort of glimpses of a more holistic way of living and perhaps a more sort of, consciousness-driven way of living. What I'm wondering is, do you think there's a direct path for getting there, or do you imagine that there's going to be some sort of, breakdown that includes civil war or something like that in this country as a result of the crisis that we're in now? I mean, I can't see an easy transition from the level of fear and the distortion of reality that we're in. It seems to me very analogous to 9/11, and that there were no weapons of mass destruction. There wasn't a reason really to invade Iraq. There wasn't a reason for us to give up the rights that we gave up to the Patriot Act and so on. But there was a lot of fear, and a lot of fear was cultivated by media, so that people seem to feel automatically, I have to do this, I have to go in this direction. So, I wonder if we're at a moment still where we're going to enter into something, that will not allow people to question or open to at least in an immediate way, to the kind of investigation that would allow them to expand or change or transform. I mean, do you have a feeling for that, or do you just don't,
Yes.
you don't know?
I don't think that there's a direct path to where we're going. It's a very indirect path that is actually going to require many, many initiations. And at best, we can only know the next step of the path, but we can't see it. There's no map. And as far as civil strife, civil war, I think that the body politic, our collective body, will go through a mighty struggle, analogous to the intense internal struggle that someone might go through when they're in going through a life initiation, going through a deep illness, going through the collapse of a marriage, when you have different voices contending within you, trying to establish meaning and trying to figure it out, what's happening to me. And then sometimes, maybe often, it's when that struggle is exhausted. Those contending voices give up, and you give up the fight. To give up the fight to understand. Only then does understanding come, because only then have the already existing ways of seeing and ways of being been exhausted. Only then is there room for a new thing. And so I think very likely, we're going to see civil war or something like that.
Something like that.
A mighty internal struggle of the body politic.
Right.
And when those two sides get exhausted, then a magnificent peace can be born. And so what is our role in this? Maybe it's to sow the seeds of that peace. Maybe it's to seed the new story that we will not be ready for until the old has completely exhausted itself.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I mean, I think that there's room to begin to recognize, like I'm for my own part, what I'm especially interested in is developing a whole new attitude towards death. And I don't mean the sort of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I mean, that was great that happened and so on, but it was not nearly enough. And there's so much that has been explored about death. And the Tibetans, of course, are real scientists of death. And then there's also a lot of Western science. But we've been afraid to actually, for whatever reason, look deeply into the transformation of death. And of course, it's I think if people could begin to see death as a transition and something that is deeply connected to them personally in a way that is very interesting, and that we could form communities to help people die with confidence, just the opposite of what happened during this COVID time, when so many people, like 43% I saw at one point of the deaths in the US were people that were living in care centers, nursing homes, or residential centers where nobody was there to go through the process with them, not their families, not their friends. We weren't allowed to put on protective gear and to sign a consent form to go sit. I have a good friend right now who's in a care center, and I have not been able to stand I have to see her through a screen and a plexiglass and just kind of wave at her for an hour, So the fact that we let so many people die during this time, and that we don't understand death as an aspect of life, we don't understand the transformation, the transition of consciousness through it. I feel like that's something that's coming, that's just on the horizon, and that it's a very big part of the anxiety that people feel right now, because if they felt, let's say, more comfortable with death as a transitional process, this virus is mostly killing people who are old. It's mostly killing people that would die from something pretty soon anyway.
The median age of death is like 79 or something like that, or 80.
I
Yeah.
know. And that's the normal human lifespan is 80, give or take 5 years. So those people would be dying of something, you know, it just wouldn't be this virus. So it's not as though the virus is actually creating a terrible catastrophe for people at all ages. You know, there are some people die at other ages, but by and large, it's this one age group. And that's the age group that would be dying anyway, and that we've taken in many cases, people take these extreme measures at the end of their natural lifespan, you know, to extend their lives by maybe 2 months and make themselves totally miserable. And you know, it's not a way to die. And so it seems to me that that's one of the horizons that is opening and coming into view. And another one, as you mentioned, is gardening and local communities, you know, that are forming and have been forming even, you know, before this confinement. But it's difficult for me to envision how destructive some sort of civil strife or civil war could be in America at this time. I mean, I've really hoped through this long time of polarization, I've hoped that we could avoid another civil war, because we've already done that once, you know, and it was a total disaster. But I agree with you. I don't think we're going to find this transformation without some kind of struggle. I don't think unless something happens that I can't see at all, you know, which I suppose is possible because I have no crystal ball. I mean, I just, you know, I just kind of look around and try to understand what's going on. But I think there is a way that humanity and human beings may be at the edge of what you were describing as, you know, their immature dependence, and just seeing the horizon of what mature dependence would look like. And of course, it would involve a different relationship to the planet. But by and large, it would also require a different relationship to each other, like just really the end of killing each other for having different opinions. You know, it's like human beings don't kill each other because of resources. We kill each other because of our opinions, you know, because somebody believes this or they see things this way and that doesn't agree with me. And so, you know, that's something that I feel really we have to learn to stop doing. And it requires a lot of restraint and constraint. But I think it's possible.
Without solving polarization, if that doesn't change, then no problem can be solved.
Exactly. Yes. Nothing else can be solved. It has to be solved first. And people have to see that the kind of being that we are includes language. And as Mary Oliver says, you know, the role of human beings seems to be that we stand around and wring our hands and say, what does it mean? What does it mean? You know, we're not silent like a rock. We don't flow like the water. We do this one thing with language, but it is also, you know, it's the way that we could learn not to kill each other, talk to each other instead. But on the other hand, we make up these narratives that turn us against each other. So it's like our ability to speak, and to speak abstractly, to speak of things that are not happening in the room, is this tremendous gift and this tremendous difficulty. You know, it sort of has these qualities that make it extremely interesting. And again, I feel like we're the only animal on earth that can stop, you know, mid-action and say, wait a minute, I don't want to do that, because that would actually harm somebody, or can apologize, you know. And so we have these capacities that could help us a lot if we use them, you know, in regard to getting polarized. So in that way, you know, I mean, I feel like your vision is a hopeful vision, and I've been feeling much more bleak about things. But I mean, even in talking with you, I feel a little less bleak because I think that sort of from your corner of the world, you see what's possible in the development of a let's say a hopeful way of being. And somewhat from my corner of the world as a therapist, what I have seen is this consuming preoccupation with control. And I've seen it so much. And in a way where I live here, I make the joke that the people I treat in therapy are neurotic Buddhists, because everybody's kind of a Buddhist. I live in sort of a Buddhist ghetto. Everybody claims to be a Buddhist or practice mindfulness, even if they don't, I don't know. But I can see the limits of that approach, because it doesn't necessarily counteract the desire for control. And,
yeah, that's one reason I decided not to become a Buddhist. I was like, I'm not really sure if it's doing much good.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I tell you, I've been in the Buddhist world for a very long time now, and I've been in many communities and seen a lot of people, mostly North American Buddhists, although some in Japan too. But yeah, there are some problems within Buddhism. I think there are a couple of areas where Buddhism is extraordinary. One is the vision of dependent arising, or how things emerge from contingencies and they're not predetermined. And the other area is in regard to rebirth and how it works.
I mean, I think there's a lot of really important insights. Like I'm not dismissing the religion at all, but
there are a lot of problems.
Actually, I want to touch on something you just said. You talking about your psychotherapy clients, and this thing about control. And I'm curious, what are the circumstances in which they really truly let go of control to a significant degree? Like, what has to happen?
One is when they're dying. That's amazing. When somebody's actually dying, it's amazing what they can accomplish as long as they stay conscious. And I've gone through that process with some people. Another is, I guess, how would I say this? So earlier when you were mentioning the birth process, so my first baby weighed 10 pounds, 1.5 ounces. That's my daughter, who's very tall now. And going through that birth process, I had to surrender control completely, because I didn't want to take any kind of drug or anything. And I was in North Carolina in a rural area. The doctor didn't know what was happening. Basically I had this huge baby. It was a long childbirth. I didn't know if I was dying or if I was giving birth. At times I thought I was dying, and other times I thought I was the baby. I mean, it was just so confusing. I've only taken LSD once in my life. It was not a pleasant experience, but it was like giving birth. It was kind of like I had to surrender control completely. And I had a pretty psychotic experience. I have a kind of, I would say my core personality has a lot of psychosis in it. I'm not very neurotic. I'm more like the other side. But it was similar to childbirth. Like, I knew that once I took that LSD, I was going through. I could not get out. I was going to have to go through. And I think when people experience something like that, where they have to surrender control because they're going through something, and there's no way that they can control it, they're in a process. They're still conscious, but they're in a process that is taking them. Then I think they some people freak out and they then actually make things worse, but some people can surrender control. So, in therapy, I find that sometimes, so I do a lot of couples therapy, and sometimes when people really see that losing their relationship is going to be more painful than staying, they can begin to surrender control. So, it's often in these moments where something is overtaking the ego,
Yeah. The reason I asked is because I want to apply it to the collective. What's it going to take for us to collectively release control to a significant degree? And it's not like control is bad, or that
No,
we
no,
shouldn't do
it's
anything to
necessary
preserve
sometimes.
the separate
Yeah,
self, or to
right,
stay alive.
right,
It's just, what is it in service to? And what's the most important thing? And it's kind of taken on a life of its own.
right, right, right. And I think it's been in service to survival. I mean, I do think it's like a grasping on to survival. But any fantasy of survival, whether it's your kid or, your own health or whether, it's usually a fantasy of survival rather than real survival, because in real survival, you actually do need flexibility. You need to surrender. You need to give in. You need to recognize modestly that you don't know what's going on,
Right.
But in that fantasy that you can grasp onto something and make it be the way you want it to be, I do think that it's a lot about survival, and in this fantasy of survival. So I guess I think that I don't know. I mean, I don't know with the whole COVID thing. I feel like the challenge is to really see what this virus is and isn't, and not to be so afraid of something that really is about it's really about the end of it's about the end of the lifespan mostly, and there is a lifespan, and it does have an end, and it's kind of like we all signed the contract when we came in here that this thing was going to end, and if we could just find that to be interesting and engaging rather than terrible and diminishing, I don't know, but I think the disease itself has a character that is kind of interesting, and yet from the very beginning I said, I'm not so afraid of the disease, but I'm afraid of what people are going to do about this, and that's where I've continued to be concerned. I think that. Like you say in your essay, and I have certainly felt it, that whole range of what we called normal was getting more and more extreme. It had to crack. It had to break. And this is breaking it, but not in the way, let's say, I would have hoped. I would have hoped for something where people were being less controlling,
To a large degree, it's not breaking normal, it's intensifying normal.
It's intensifying normal. You're right. But to walk around and see all these people in masks and to realize, it's very hard to read a face with a mask on it. It's very hard for children to tell whether someone is angry or happy or anything with a mask on. That is bizarre. The whole thing. Like when I think about it, I realize how bizarre it is.
But it's interesting to me that before COVID, people were more and more masked. Before COVID, because so much communication is online, it's harder and harder to tell if what somebody's really feeling.
That's right.
Before COVID,
right.
more and more of life was moving online. Before COVID, the consciousness of safety and control was rising. Before COVID, the tendencies toward the totalitarian police state were intensifying. Nothing is new here.
Right.
Really.
Right.
But people were more and more afraid of each other. More and more distanced. Social distancing was already happening. Public space was already becoming, more and more contained. Less and less of life was happening in public. More and more was happening in private. More and more distance education. I mean, really, everything that we're seeing now is a continuation of longstanding trends. It's not a reset.
It's like an extreme exaggeration of it. And in a sense, the masks. So I've done a number of talks about the archetype of contagion and about the meaning of masks. And masks have always meant disguise. And they've been used at Carnival. They've been used by the Ku Klux Klan. They've been used in the burqa. I mean, anytime you want to disguise, and usually you're disguising for nefarious purposes, you're not generally disguising for good reasons. And now, you know, lots of people wearing masks creates anxiety about other people also. And, you know, I think for children especially, they don't understand what's going on, and they have to see people masked all the time. I know my 5-year-old grandson is afraid of going outside because he's afraid that that's where the germs are, you know, because he's heard so much about staying in. And of course, he doesn't understand what a germ is, you know.
Yeah.
It's just that the story is you're safer inside. And that,
I mean, and again, the childhood has been migrating inside for my whole lifetime.
right,
Yeah.
that's true. That's true. But not this extreme. I mean, it's true, you know, and at the same time, there's something sort of bizarre, or let's say even sort of monstrous about wearing masks all the time and being around a lot of masked people. You know, it's like, I wonder if people will feel that and react to it. And I know all over Europe there are a lot more protests about the wearing of masks and so on than there have been in America. But I sometimes have fantasies when I'm out that everybody's just going to rip their mask off and dance or something, you know, and stop this, because also there's just no infection around here. But if I say that, people say, but you could be asymptomatic. I say, no, not really, because you have to be in touch with somebody who's infected in order to be asymptomatic. But, you know, so that sense of removal, it's extreme now. And maybe it will push our buttons, you know, to the degree that we just can't stand it anymore to be so isolated from each other. I don't know, you know. It's I think that one thing that I have liked, and I'm liking talking to you this way, I have liked being able to talk to people. I've been talking in these interviews with people that I've always wanted to talk to, but would not have met up with otherwise, because I'd be too busy flying around in my niche and talking to the people that, you know, kind of want to talk to me. And now I've gotten to talk to people I want to talk to, you know? And that's been really nice. So I'm going to land this plane where we're ending here, and I think this is an interesting point to end. I wonder if you want to add anything about just sort of what you see from, you know, your perch, about what you think is coming next, or what you imagine will come in, you know, as a result of the election, or
whether it's the election or something else. I think we're going to have some kind of event that will be an even harder strike on our collective identity and our sense making of the world. And that this barrage will continue until the world cracks. So
I agree with you. I actually agree with you. I'm glad you said it before I said it, because I think your intuition is correct. I really do.
It could be something so far beyond what anybody is expecting that you know, it could just be like this, almost like this gift that comes often at the moment of maximum despair.
That would be lovely. And, you know, I want to mention Lewis Hyde and gift, because you mentioned gift a lot, and I assume you've been influenced by Lewis Hyde. And I love the idea of gift. And I think also people often misunderstand it and don't know how to receive it, and, you know, see it more like, I often think that people think that gifts should be like ordering from a catalog. You know, it should be what you want instead of what you get. And I can imagine that the gift coming for all of us, you know, might not be exactly what we want, but it could be a gift that we get.
the best gifts are something that's beyond what we even know to ask for.
Right.
And I do think that something like that is coming.
Well, thank you so much. That's a great place to end. And thank you for being here with me and offering your ideas so generously. And I look forward to talking with you some more.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Thank you, Charles. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.